In the grand theatre of galactic civilization, where common sense had long ago been sacrificed on the altar of scientific progress, the consortium of civilized species operated what they proudly called their most advanced research facility, Xenological Research Station Omega-7. This particular outpost had earned its reputation the hard way by housing the galaxy's most diplomatically inconvenient specimens while maintaining the pretense that everything was perfectly under control. The station's current roster read like a who's who of evolutionary nightmares, creatures that had clawed their way to the top of food chains so brutal that most civilized species required therapy just from reading the field reports. Each specimen lived in carefully calibrated containment systems designed by the finest minds in the galaxy, monitored by sensors that could detect a hostile thought from 3 sectors away, and guarded by security protocols that would make a paranoid dictator weep with envy. The consortium had spent the better part of 3 centuries perfecting their approach to what they euphemistically called Death World Management. Their solution was elegantly simple: maintain a respectful distance, take detailed notes, and under no circumstances make direct contact with anything that could theoretically eat you. This strategy had worked magnificently for everyone involved, particularly the insurance companies, which made the arrival of the human researcher all the more catastrophic. The transport shuttle that delivered this particular specimen of humanity to Omega-7 should have been the first warning sign. Most civilized species arrived in sleek, sterile vessels that whispered through space with the dignity of a funeral procession. The humans' shuttle, by contrast, looked like someone had taken a perfectly good spaceship and decided to see what would happen if they hit it with a hammer for several hours. It bore scorch marks, dents, and what appeared to be bite marks from something with teeth the size of dinner plates. The human emerged from this mechanical disaster with the kind of casual confidence that suggested either supreme competence or complete detachment from reality. Station Command, observing from their climate-controlled bunker 12 levels below, immediately began updating their life insurance policies. Dr. Vexhai, the station's chief xenobiologist, watched the newcomer through the security feeds with the expression of someone who had just realized they'd accidentally volunteered for a suicide mission. "Remind me again why we agreed to this cultural exchange program?" "Political pressure," replied his assistant, a nervous Kithari whose species had evolved from prey animals and consequently viewed everything with suspicion. "The Terran Coalition insisted on contributing to our research efforts. Something about mutual understanding and shared scientific advancement." "Ah, yes, the same species that considers armed conflict a form of competitive sport." The human had now reached the main research level, where they paused to examine the directory of current specimens with what could only be described as enthusiasm. This was concerning. Most visitors to Omega-7 examined the directory with the kind of morbid fascination normally reserved for natural disasters or tax audits. "They're heading for Section 7, observed the assistant, his voice climbing several octaves. Dr. Vexai's secondary heart stopped beating. Section 7 housed their most problematic resident, a creature that had arrived 3 months ago from a planet so hostile that the survey team had nicknamed it "Please Let Us Leave Now." The thing in containment had been classified as a Class X apex predator, which was scientific terminology for "will absolutely murder everything in sight and probably enjoy it." Standing 4 meters tall when fully extended, covered in what appeared to be living armor and possessed of enough teeth to stock a small dental museum, the creature had earned its reputation through a combination of raw lethality and strategic intelligence that suggested it was probably smarter than most of the research staff. It had already demonstrated an unfortunate tendency to solve problems by applying overwhelming violence, and the station's security chief had taken to drinking heavily whenever anyone mentioned Section 7. The human approached the containment viewing area with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested they knew exactly what they were doing. This was either very good news or spectacularly bad news, and given the day's track record, Dr. Vexai was prepared to bet on the latter. Through the reinforced transparent aluminium barrier, the apex predator lounged in its artificial habitat with the lazy confidence of something that had never met a problem it couldn't solve with its claws. Its 6 eyes tracked the human's approach with the kind of predatory focus that made seasoned researchers reach for their emergency teleportation devices. The humans stopped directly in front of the containment unit, placed their hands on their hips, and said something that the universal translator rendered as, "Well, "Aren't you just magnificent?" The creature's response was immediate and deeply unsettling. Instead of the usual threat display, which typically involved enough roaring to set off seismic sensors 3 levels down, it tilted its head with what could only be described as curiosity. "Did it just—" began the assistant. "I don't know," Dr. Vexai interrupted, "and I'm not sure I want to find out." The human had begun talking to the creature in the kind of conversational tone normally reserved for discussing weather or weekend plans. The apex predator, meanwhile, had moved closer to the barrier and was exhibiting behavior patterns that didn't appear in any of the scientific literature. Specifically, it appeared to be listening. "Sir," said the assistant, his voice now resembling a small animal in distress, "should we activate the emergency containment protocols?" Dr. Vexhai considered this question while watching the human gesture animatedly at the creature, which was now making a sound that the monitoring equipment couldn't quite classify. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a purr, and definitely wasn't anything that should be coming from something capable of reducing a hover tank to scrap metal. "I think," he said finally, "we're going to need a bigger insurance policy." The morning shift at Omega 7 began with what the staff had come to recognize as their new daily ritual, gathering around the monitoring stations to watch their human researchers systematically demolish every principle of xenobiological safety ever conceived. Dr. Vexhai arrived at the observation deck clutching a mug of stimulant that was roughly 80% caffeine and 20% wishful thinking, only to discover that the human had somehow gained access to the restricted maintenance corridors. "How exactly," he asked his trembling assistant, "did they bypass 17 different security checkpoints, 2 biometric scanners, and a lock that requires quantum-level encryption to open?" "They ask politely," came the reply, delivered in the tone of someone who had given up trying to understand the universe. The monitoring feeds showed the human now standing inside the apex predator's containment habitat. Not the viewing area, not the outer safety zone, but actually inside the enclosure itself. This development represented such a catastrophic breach of protocol that the station's AI had apparently suffered what could only be described as a nervous breakdown and was now playing soothing music while repeatedly announcing that everything was fine. The creature, meanwhile, had positioned itself approximately 3 meters from the human, which in the vocabulary of apex predator behavior translated to either preparing to attack or showing cautious interest. Given that the human was still breathing and possessed of all their limbs, the research team was tentatively betting on the latter, though nobody was quite ready to update the insurance forms yet. "Are they talking to it?" whispered Dr. Kenthara, the station's behavioral specialist, whose own species communicated primarily through carefully modulated scent releases. Indeed, the human appeared to be engaged in what could generously be called a conversation with something that possessed roughly the same capacity for reasoned discourse as a natural disaster. They gestured with their hands, tilted their head at angles that suggested active listening, and occasionally made sounds that the universal translator was gamely attempting to render as words. The apex predator's response was even more disturbing. It had begun to mirror some of the human's gestures, though given that its appendages ended in claws capable of opening armored vehicles like tin cans, the effect was somewhat unsettling. More concerning still, it had started making vocalizations that weren't quite roars, weren't quite growls, and definitely weren't in any xenobiological textbook. "Sir," said the assistant, his voice now resembling the sound of air slowly escaping from a punctured balloon. "I think it's trying to communicate back." Dr. Vexahai took a long sip of his stimulant and wondered if it was too late to transfer to a nice safe job in hazardous waste disposal. "That's impossible. Class X apex predators don't engage in interspecies communication. They engage in interspecies consumption." As if to prove him wrong, the human had apparently produced some form of sustenance from their equipment pack and was now offering it to the creature. This represented such a fundamental violation of feeding protocols that several junior researchers had begun quietly updating their wills. The apex predator examined the offering with the kind of careful attention normally reserved for potential threats or mating displays. After a moment that seemed to stretch into geological time, it delicately accepted the food item, using what were probably its least lethal appendages. "Did it just say thank you?" asked Dr. Kentara, her scent glands releasing what the translation software helpfully identified as existential confusion mixed with mild panic. The creature had indeed produced a vocalization that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to gratitude, though delivered in a register that made the station's hull plating vibrate sympathetically. The human responded with what appeared to be pleased laughter, a sound that should have triggered every predator instinct the creature possessed. Instead, the apex predator moved closer. This development caused the monitoring station to erupt in the kind of controlled chaos normally associated with imminent reactor breaches. Emergency protocols flickered to life across dozens of screens. Automated systems began preparing for evacuation procedures, and someone in the background could be heard quietly sobbing. The human, blissfully unaware that they had just caused a minor mental health crisis among the research staff, had begun what could only be described as play behavior. They picked up a piece of debris from the habitat floor and tossed it across the enclosure. The apex predator watched the trajectory with the focused intensity of something calculating optimal hunting angles, then bounded after the object with a grace that defied both physics and common sense. "It's playing fetch," announced Dr. Vexrai in the tone of someone who had just realized they were living in a universe where the laws of nature were more like gentle suggestions. The creature retrieved the debris and returned it to the human, who responded with the kind of enthusiastic praise typically reserved for exceptionally clever pets. The apex predator's response was to produce what could only be described as a pleased rumble, though one that registered on seismic equipment 3 levels down. Word of this development spread through the station with the efficiency of a computer virus, though considerably more disturbing. Within hours, representatives from 17 different species had requested permission to observe the phenomenon, while another 23 had submitted formal complaints about the complete abandonment of established safety protocols. The Kethari delegation was particularly vocal in their disapproval, pointing out that their homeworld's primary cultural export was a comprehensive manual on not getting eaten by things bigger than you. The human's behavior represented a direct contradiction of approximately 4,000 years of evolutionary wisdom. The Vrexnari, whose own encounters with apex predators typically ended with strategic carpet bombing from orbit, had submitted a formal request for the human to be classified as a potential weapon of mass destruction. Meanwhile, in the containment habitat, the human had somehow convinced the creature to participate in what appeared to be mutual grooming behavior. This involved the human using some form of cleaning implement on the creature's armored hide, while the apex predator carefully preened the human's hair with appendages that could theoretically separate their head from their shoulders with minimal effort. "I need another stimulant," announced Dr. Vexai. "A stronger one, possibly one that induces temporary amnesia." The assistant nodded sympathetically while updating the daily incident report, which had grown to approximately 47 pages and was beginning to read like either a scientific journal or a suicide note. As the day progressed, the impossible partnership continued to evolve in ways that challenged every established principle of xenobiology. The human and apex predator had developed what appeared to be a shared language consisting of gestures, vocalizations, and an understanding that transcended species barriers. By evening, they were napping together. 3 weeks into what the station's medical officer had officially classified as the ongoing psychological trauma, Omega-7's carefully orchestrated routine of controlled panic was interrupted by an alarm that nobody particularly wanted to hear. The primary fusion reactor, which had been humming along peacefully for the better part of a decade, had apparently decided that this was an excellent time to develop what the engineering staff euphemistically called performance issues. Chief Engineer Zaldis, a Vrexnari whose species had evolved from creatures that lived in symbiosis with nuclear reactors, delivered the news with the kind of professional calm that suggested either supreme competence or complete resignation to fate. "We have approximately 47 minutes before the containment field destabilizes and turns us all into constituent atoms." Station Commander Hethvar, whose own species had developed an admirable talent for surviving impossible situations through careful planning and strategic cowardice, immediately activated the emergency evacuation protocols. Across the station, klaxons began wailing with the enthusiasm of beings who had been waiting their entire mechanical lives for this moment. "All personnel to evacuation pods," announced the station AI, its voice carrying just a hint of what might have been relief. Please proceed in an orderly fashion to your designated assembly points. Do not attempt to retrieve personal belongings, pets, or scientific specimens. This last instruction was presumably directed at the research staff, who had a documented tendency to prioritize their work over their continued existence. The evacuation procedures had been designed with meticulous care to ensure that everyone could reach safety within 30 minutes, assuming they followed the established protocols and didn't stop to argue with apex predators. The human, as it turned out, had not received the memo about following established protocols. Dr. Vexai, racing toward the evacuation pods with the kind of urgency normally reserved for fleeing natural disasters, paused at the monitoring station long enough to check on their most problematic specimens. What he saw there caused him to stop running and start questioning his life choices. The human was standing in front of the apex predator's containment unit, engaged in what appeared to be an animated discussion with the creature about the current emergency. The apex predator, meanwhile, was exhibiting behavior patterns that didn't appear in any crisis manual. It was agitated, but not in the way that suggested it was preparing to use the chaos as an opportunity for violence. Instead, it seemed genuinely concerned about the evacuation. "They're not leaving," observed the assistant, who had also stopped fleeing for his life in order to gawk at this latest impossibility. The security feeds showed the human attempting to access the containment unit's emergency release mechanisms, which were protected by approximately 17 different fail-safes, specifically designed to prevent this exact scenario. The apex predator, apparently understanding the human's intentions, was providing what could only be described as moral support, though delivered in vocalizations that were causing structural vibrations throughout the section. Station Commander Hethvar's voice crackled over the communication system, with the kind of barely controlled panic that suggested his species' survival instincts were currently engaged in hand-to-hand combat with his professional obligations. "All research personnel report to evacuation pods immediately. This includes whoever is currently attempting to breach containment in Section 7. The human's response was to continue working on the containment release, with the focused determination of someone who had apparently decided that certain principles were more important than continued existence. The apex predator, meanwhile, had begun what appeared to be an attempt to help by applying its considerable physical capabilities to the problem of reinforced containment barriers. "Sir," said the assistant, his voice reaching frequencies that were probably causing distress to small animals throughout the sector, "they're going to try to evacuate it." Dr. Vexai stared at the monitoring feeds with the expression of someone who had just realized that the universe was operating according to rules that nobody had bothered to explain to him. "That's impossible. Class X specimens can't be safely transported. The containment requirements alone would require a specialized vessel with—" His explanation was interrupted by the sound of reinforced barriers giving way under the combined efforts of human ingenuity and apex predator strength. The containment unit, which had been designed to withstand anything short of stellar collapse, opened with the kind of reluctant mechanical groan that suggested it was as surprised as everyone else. The apex predator emerged from its habitat with the cautious movements of something that understood the gravity of the situation. Instead of the rampage that every security protocol had been designed to prevent, it positioned itself protectively near the human and began making vocalizations that the translation system was rendering as complex emotional concepts involving loyalty, partnership, and determination. "They're talking about staying together," whispered Dr. Kentara, who had apparently decided that witnessing this development was worth the risk of becoming part of it. The human's response was to place what appeared to be a reassuring hand on the creature's armored hide, while simultaneously working to override the section's lockdown protocols. The apex predator, meanwhile, had begun scanning their surroundings with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested it was preparing to defend their position against potential threats. This assessment proved remarkably prescient when station security arrived in full crisis gear, equipped with enough firepower to level a small moon, and the kind of professional determination that came from extensive training in dealing with containment breaches. They took one look at the human and apex predators standing together in apparent partnership, and immediately began updating their threat assessments. "Stand down and proceed to evacuation," ordered Security Chief Vorthak, whose own species had evolved from pack hunters and consequently understood the dynamics of dangerous partnerships. "Unauthorized specimen release is a Code 7 violation." The human's response was to step protectively in front of the apex predator, which itself had begun displaying what could only be described as defensive posturing. The creature's 6 eyes tracked the security team's movements with predatory focus, while its vocalizations shifted to frequencies that made everyone's survival instincts start filing complaints with their central nervous systems. "They're protecting each other," observed Dr. Vexai, his voice carrying the kind of wonder normally reserved for witnessing natural phenomena or religious experiences. The standoff that followed was the kind of tense moment that would probably be analyzed in tactical manuals for decades to come. On one side stood station security, professionally trained and heavily armed. On the other stood a human and an apex predator who had apparently decided that their partnership transcended species barriers, evacuation protocols, and basic survival instincts. The reactor chose that moment to remind everyone that it was still in the process of achieving catastrophic failure, announcing its displeasure through a series of vibrations that caused the station's hull to emit concerning groans. 15 minutes to containment failure, announced the AI helpfully. The human made a decision that would probably be studied in xenopsychology classes until the heat death of the universe. They turned to the apex predator and began communicating in the gesture and vocalization language they had developed together. The creature's response was immediate and decisive. It moved to place itself between the human and the security team, while making sounds that the translation system was struggling to categorize as either protective declarations or battle cries. Security Chief Vorthak, faced with the prospect of engaging an apex predator that was defending its chosen partner, made the kind of tactical decision that survival manuals throughout the galaxy would later cite as either brilliant or insane. He ordered his team to stand down and focus on evacuation procedures. "We're not equipped to handle this," he announced over the communication system, requesting immediate reinforcement and specialized containment protocols. The apex predator's response suggested it had understood both the words and their implications, because it began making the kind of vocalizations that were probably visible on seismic equipment in neighboring star systems. The universe, it seemed, had developed a taste for dramatic irony. With less than 10 minutes remaining before the reactor decided to redecorate the local star system, reinforcements arrived in the form of a full containment team, equipped with enough exotic weaponry to make small wars look like polite disagreements. Their leader, a veteran handler whose species had made professional paranoia into an art form, took one look at the situation and immediately began reconsidering their career choices. "Target the creature," ordered Commander Kethral, raising a weapon that hummed with barely contained energy. "Neutralize the threat and extract the human." The apex predator's response was immediate and educational. It positioned itself directly between the weapons and the human, spreading its armored form to provide maximum coverage while producing vocalizations that registered somewhere between a war cry and a funeral dirge. The message was unmistakably clear. Getting to the human meant going through approximately 4 meters of highly motivated apex predator. The human, meanwhile, had apparently decided that this was an excellent time to demonstrate the legendary stubbornness their species was famous for. They placed both hands on the creature's flank and began speaking in the rapid, urgent tones of someone delivering either a pep talk or last words. 5 minutes to containment failure, announced the AI, its voice now carrying what could only be described as existential resignation. What happened next would be discussed in xenobiological circles for generations, though most of the accounts would be dismissed as either elaborate fiction or the result of stress-induced hallucinations. The apex predator, faced with the choice between its own survival and protecting its human companion, made a decision that redefined every assumption about predator behavior. He charged, not at the human, not at the security team, but directly toward the failing reactor containment, moving with the kind of purposeful determination that suggested it had identified the real threat to its partner's survival. The creature's armored hide, evolved to survive on a death world where the environment itself was actively hostile, began to glow as it approached the radiation-saturated core area. The human's reaction was instantaneous and heart-rending. They sprinted after the creature, shouting what the universal translator was rendering as a mixture of protest, pleading, and something that might have been a declaration of love. The apex predator paused just long enough to turn back and produce a vocalization so complex that the translation system simply gave up and displayed a series of emotional concepts: protection, sacrifice, gratitude, and bond. deeper than blood. Then it disappeared into the reactor chamber, where its unique physiology and natural radiation resistance made it the only being on the station capable of manually stabilizing the containment field. The readings on the emergency displays immediately began shifting from catastrophic failure imminent to crisis temporarily averted, though the cost was becoming tragically clear. The humans stood at the threshold of the reactor chamber, separated from their companion by levels of radiation that would reduce most species to constituent atoms. Through the reinforced barriers, they could see the apex predator working with methodical precision to repair the damage, its armored form beginning to show the effects of exposure that would have killed anything else in minutes. "It's buying us time," whispered Dr. Vex-High, his voice carrying the kind of awe normally reserved for witnessing the impossible. The creature completed its work and turned toward the barrier one final time. The human pressed their hands against the reinforced surface, while the apex predator mirrored the gesture from the other side. The vocalizations it produced were too complex for translation, but their meaning was unmistakable, a farewell that transcended species, language, and the vast gulf between predator and prey. As the evacuation proceeded in orderly fashion, Dr. Vex-High found himself standing in the observation deck of the rescue vessel, watching Omega-7 recede into the distance. The human sat nearby, staring out at the stars with the expression of someone who had just learned that friendship was a force more powerful than evolution, gravity, or common sense. "I suppose," he said finally, "we'll need to revise our classification system." The human looked up with eyes that held depths of understanding that most civilized species spent millennia trying to achieve. "Maybe the problem isn't with the predators," they said quietly. "Maybe it's with how we define civilization." Dr. Vex-High considered this observation while contemplating the vast complexity of a universe where an apex predator could choose love over survival, and a human could teach the galaxy that the most dangerous creatures were often the most capable of profound connection. Somewhere in the distance, Omega-7's automated systems continued their work, maintaining the memorial that would mark the place where a death world's ultimate predator had chosen to become something else entirely, a friend.